Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the Sister Augusta Maria Auditorium for our, as Mike says, final Trinity talk for this academic year. So again, whether you're an alumnus, whether you're a member of staff, a student, one of our business partners, one of our school partners, whether you've never been to the campus before, it's really my pleasure very much to welcome you here this evening. Again, as Mike said, we launched our Trinity Talk series to celebrate, or as part of our celebrations for our 50th anniversary year, to showcase our alumni, our associates, our friends of the university. And I'm sure those of you who've attended at least one, if not all of those talks, will agree with me that they've been of an extremely high calibre, extremely interesting and motivating, and no pressure, Dame Louise, but I'm sure this evening is going to be no exception to that, and I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming the British Government official Dame Louise Casey, DBE CB, this evening. So Dame Louise has spent almost 20 years working in social welfare within British Government. She's held several roles, including Deputy Director for the Homelessness Charity Shelter, Director of Home Office Antisocial Behaviour Unit. She was the UK's first independent Commissioner for Victims and Witnesses, and Director General of the UK Government's Troubled Families team. At the request of Eric Pickles, Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, and in the wake of the Rotherham child sex abuse scandal, Dame Louise was appointed to lead the inspection of children's services at Rotherham Council in 2014. Following this report, she was appointed by the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, to conduct a review into community cohesion and extremism in some of our most isolated communities. The Casey Review was published in December last year, suggesting worrying levels of segregation and social inclusion in the UK. Her report makes several recommendations, including the need for an integration oath to highlight British values, a focus on the promotion of English language, and encouraging social mixing among young people. Dame Louise received the Companion of the Order of Bath in the Queen's Birthday Honours in 2008, and Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the Queen's Birthday Honours in 2016 for her services to families and vulnerable people. I am genuinely thrilled and truly honoured to welcome Dame Louise here this evening, and it's now my pleasure to invite her to the podium to deliver her Trinity talk, A Life in Public Service. Dame Louise Casey.
I have to confess to being slightly jealous that I saw alcohol in the room next door, and some of you even got a nice little glass in front of you, but I'm probably not allowed to say that, am I? No, okay, that's the first thing I'm not allowed to say. I'm really genuinely humbled by that introduction. So many letters behind the name nowadays, it's a bit bizarre, but anyway, there we are. Not bad for where we emanate from. So, I love Leeds. I don't think it's any secret that colleagues in Leeds City Council know that I'm regularly up and down in all sorts of jobs that I have done. I think it's a wonderful, vibrant city, a student city, all sorts of things, culture, everything. It's a great place, and actually it's really lovely to be here this evening, particularly at Trinity, so thank you for having me. I'm not used to delivering lectures or talks in university halls, so the very fact you're all in a university situation I personally found slightly intimidating, but I shall press on in my inimitable way. I did have one of my kind of Sister Eater moments, I have to say, with the sort of, I wish you could see me now at Trinity University in Leeds, and a woman of heart and of faith who gave me both guidance, love and care throughout much of my childhood, and like so many women of faith, devoted to those they teach and those whom in many ways they actually bring up. Over the many years of working in some of the most difficult areas of social policy, I have seen for myself the huge contribution that faith-based community organisations play in supporting so many vulnerable citizens. I've also seen prejudice against those organisations that are inspired by their faith, and I've seen prejudice by faith-based organisations about those who have none. We can all, I think, recognise the tremendous good that is often done in the name of faith. We can also recognise that faith, as in strong beliefs held in the doctrines of a religion, is not a prerequisite of faith in humanity or indeed in the human values that underpin public service, be that public service paid or unpaid. Having stepped down for a domestic role in the UK as their homelessness coordinator in 2003, I much later joined DePaul International as a trustee, and this has given me a real insight into an almost frankly sometimes invisible network of faith-based organisations that provide a safety net and so much more for homeless people. The Vincentian movement delivers services to homeless people, to refugees, to the dispossessed, indeed the poor across the globe. Founded by St Vincent de Paul and St Louise de Marillac, the Daughters of Charity did something really interesting for women of faith. They left the closed convents and they went onto the streets, putting their faith in action by serving the poor. I'm obviously, as you can tell, proud of the work that DePaul International does and to be part of them. But I'm not here tonight to talk about DePaul. While I fully acknowledge the power of faith to bring about change, I simply don't think it's a necessary starting point for many of us driven by serving the public. The timing of this speech, for me personally, couldn't be more pertinent. You've asked me to talk about faith and public service, or as I would put it, the values and humanity that should at all times govern our actions. We should often remind ourselves of our own power to do collective good. And in all circumstances, we are stronger together than we are apart. I want simply to share with you some of the things that I have learned, both good and bad, in the last 3 decades, not only in central government, but actually in my time in the charity sector before that. We got some things right. I and we, no doubt, got some things wrong, and I want to reflect upon that. But alongside many others, the thing I think I will say about a life in public service, not only for me, but for many others, is that we have given it everything that we have got. We have tried to do the right thing in all circumstances, tried to help out those left behind, those out in the cold, or those even sometimes facing despair. In just a few short weeks now, I will be leaving the civil service for hopefully new things, and this has caused me to enter a period of reflection, which is why this particular talk has been, I've written myself, bizarrely, with a bit of help from Tracy, has to be said, who, takes most of what I write out, but anyway, there we are. And I wanted really to share some of those. My first thought is how much the political landscape has changed over the last 2 decades and how much that affects us and all that we can do. Of course, we're reeling at the moment from the somewhat chaos of the last few days, but I think we have to look at that chaos in a much longer period. Tony Blair, whether you like him or hate him, was the Prime Minister of this country for a whole decade. That was 10 solid years. And as I said, whatever your own political persuasion, for 10 whole years, the country had a government that set a course and charted their way in one direction. Incredibly, in the last decade that has followed, we've had 3 Prime Ministers, and if you talk to Nick Clegg, he'll say it was 4, 3 elections, 3 very significant referendums, as you know, and I'm not completely sure, as I bet nobody else is in the room, that we're completely done yet, all of which, in one way or another, have changed the course of the political environment that we are operating in as those of us in the room that are public servants. Add into that mix the 2008 economic crisis, the austerity agenda, the effects of figures like Donald Trump, and you find yourself working at a pace to keep up with such a political and changing agenda. And I think, like many people probably involved with this university in these series of talks, wanting to make sure that we're on the side of those that are going to be forgotten or indeed sometimes scapegoated. From the homelessness czar through to crime and antisocial behaviour, the Victims Commissioner, the Troubled Families Programme, the Rotherham Inspection into Child Sexual Exploitation, and more latterly the review into our most isolated communities. These roles have often been difficult, and sometimes they have tested my belief in our innate human kindness and goodness. They've been a privilege to undertake and be part of. I know that it might sound strange, but that privilege comes from being allowed to get under the skin of some of the most challenging issues that are facing some of our most vulnerable individuals, families, and communities. To be able at times to give voice to those that are most powerless citizens in our society, to be able to listen, to care for those without homes, families made vulnerable by their problems, or the teenage girl in Rotherham who has been groomed and abused, to challenge the system and indeed society, as too often we are closed with our ears and our eyes and we walk on by. And that is what I want to share with you today, some of the things that these difficult roles have left with me, not so much because I think I'm better than anybody else in this room, not at all, but what I would humbly like to pass along in the hope that we can help others better than I have done, or those that will go ahead of us. The first and the importance for me is bravery, and of the need to be brave. Now, by bravery, I don't actually mean arguments and conflict. I think people often think when you say, ooh, she's really brave, they mean she's really, challenging. I'm going to use a ruder word, but I'm watching Margaret on the front row, so I won't. Possibly slightly more afraid of you than I am even of Tracy, and that's saying something. This kind of idea really that in order to tell truth to power, somehow you've got to be rude, difficult and belligerent. That just isn't the case. I have a reputation for talking truth to power. I'm often asked to speak at this conference or that conference about how you do this, like it's some sort of 21st century management technique, or telling truth to power is out, the latest chapter in the MBA brochure. Not that I've got either of those to my name, but it's not. It's something simpler than that, and at the same time, perhaps a little harder. It's about holding up a mirror to what you have seen and to tell the truth about it, however unpalatable that may be, or however much people, or indeed yourself, does not want to hear it. To get to the bottom of complex problems by asking the questions that no one wants to ask, by challenging the status quo and ask what is not working and why. So yes, it's about, in the homelessness job, working with the outreach workers to agree that if our goal was to help long-term, extremely vulnerable people that have been out on our streets for years, it may mean sometimes not being able to help a young, mentally and physically able person sleeping rough for a couple of nights. Easy to fix the newbie, very hard to fix the elderly, vulnerable one. Shouldn't have been a choice that we should necessarily have had to make, but it was a choice that we did have to make, and it's a choice that I stand by today. Sometimes it was challenging soup runs that would not coordinate their help on the streets and ended up on some occasions creating more problems for the very people that they thought they were trying to help. I used to say relentlessly that the solution to rough sleeping is neither cheap, easy or basic, and it is more than a cup of soup. But ladies and gentlemen, when there is nothing there and there is no safety net, then a cup of soup has an important place in our society, as do our food banks that are across this city and many others in this country now. Challenging the system relentlessly is also part of telling truth to power and being brave. For example, that psychiatrists and doctors, they never ever did an assessment, nor indeed have a conversation with someone on the street. They wanted us to get that person to their surgery. We were lucky, frankly, if we could get them to come out for 2 hours every week on a Friday to a day centre, and we were grateful to them for doing that from the bottom of our hearts. But actually, that's about challenging the system, because if you're mentally ill, almost sectionable person is 12 to 14 in number on the piazza outside the cathedral in Westminster, that I can keep a psychiatrist pretty busy on that piazza on many, many a night. And I can't get them, as in the homeless people, cleaned up, dusted up, to be in an appointment that comes to them by letter to what? Their cardboard box, so they're there at 3 o'clock in the right psychiatric clinic at the right time. Frankly, ladies and gentlemen, when I go to an outpatients clinic, I struggle to find my way from clinic A to clinic B to clinic C to this, to that, to the other. So how in God's name are we expecting a mentally ill person to find that way, or indeed their worker alongside them? So another one was knocking the heads together of the two largest day centres in London, who thought it was okay and acceptable to close for exactly the same 6 weeks in the summer. They overlapped by the same 6 weeks. I'm not known for diplomacy. As I leave the civil service, nobody has ever asked me to work in the Foreign Office, nor indeed have I been sent abroad to do lots of nice dinners and things like that, and the very important work, sorry, Tracy, that they do, obviously. But, you know, I'm not exactly diplomatic, I'll put it that way. Doing the negotiations between the two organisations that ran these two day centres, when they knew in their hearts that we were right, because sometimes sleeping out in the heat is actually as challenging, if not more challenging, than sleeping out in the cold. The public don't care as much about homeless people in the heat. People drink more in the heat and often are more abusive to people that sleep on the streets in the heat. In the cold, often even the most hard-line person might actually be sympathetic to a human being sleeping on the street. Yet trying as a kid to negotiate between these two giants was really, really difficult. But they did do it. They did do it. They did do it in time. And all of this really is about saying this is not about building a system and propping it up come what may, but about starting with the person first and working out what really meets their needs. So yes, I am proud that we met the government target on rough sleeping, of course I am, but I am more proud, and I stand more firmly with more joy in my heart, that we decided from the outset that we wanted to help the most vulnerable people we could, and that in years that charities have been unable to reach out to. And if that meant we had to wait 6 months and see somebody every single week before they decided that they would come in, and they would only come in on their terms, on that night, in that way, into the accommodation they wanted to, we did it. We did it. And that's a damn sight more expensive than opening up a night shelter or a dormitory and telling people there are enough beds open. There are some areas of the world, indeed, that use expressions like functional zero on rough sleeping, and then they interpret that as being able to publicly declare that they have delivered an end to street homelessness, when in fact all they have is enough beds available for the numbers on the streets, but no one will use them, often because they are too afraid or they're too appalling places to live in. In that situation, they may have reached the target, but in my view, they have completely missed the point. So one of the points I'm trying to make is pragmatism at all times is part of what you need to be if you're in public service. And I would say counterintuitively, if you really want to get stuff done, then in my view, you start with the hardest first. Again, you clearly can see I haven't been on a management course. It's not about the metaphoric low-hanging fruit that people talk about. Easy wins is another regular political expression. We need an awful lot of easy wins so we can build momentum. Yeah, do you right? Okay. I'll rephrase that, Minister. But about sorting out the cases or issues that nobody believed anything could ever be done about, using the power of that to drive your future activity. Because helping somebody that everybody says is beyond help gives hope. And hope is one of the most powerful tools for change. And I come to a case in this, a guy called John, who is literally the person that I've just talked about. He, ex-serviceman, God knows what he'd seen in his life. This goes before the times that we were so sympathetic about ex-servicemen. These are the days when actually the army was ashamed about people that ended up on the streets and weren't necessarily as sympathetic as a country as we might be now. One of the hostels I worked in had the 2/3 of the people that used that hostel and lived in that hostel were ex-servicemen. Now we would find that an absolute drop-down horror. Then we thought at least they had somewhere to live. But the army wasn't with those people. They saw them as failures. They didn't see them as anything that necessarily needed help. When we got John in off the streets, who had literally lived in this same doorway, lovely man, very polite, God knows what had gone on in there, but he wasn't coming in. He'd been there in I've been working in homelessness for 10 years in central London, and John had been out at least those 10 years, if not a lot longer. The night John came in, news spread so quickly, and everybody thought, well, if we can solve John, we can solve anything. It's a bit like there's a lady who still walks around Victoria with her trolley, terrified woman, really, in every single way. Again, I wonder what happened to her in her life. And we got her into a sick bay in a hostel. That was her only way. She tried out the sick bay for a few months, and then eventually she came in. And she still walks around the streets of Victoria now, and she looks at me, Louise! And that's it. That's all I ever get out of her. She just grunts Louise at me, and I go, all right, and then off we go. So that's that. So what I'm trying to say here is I think sometimes we as a system and we as public servants, let alone others, forget who we're here for. When I was the anti-social behaviour czar, I was determined to stop the madness of youth centres closing on Friday nights. This is controversial, isn't it? Because it suited services to do that. There I was in a New Deal for Communities area. Some of you are old enough in the room to know the New Deal for Communities. I'm not looking at anyone in particular, but there we are. Some of you remember those initiatives, just like I do. I was there on a Wednesday evening. I went down this beautiful, well, it wasn't a new build. It was your classic youth centre. It was stacked on the end of a church, load of dusted old sofas, really good feel in it. Actually very full of kids, kids on ASBOs, kids in all sorts of situations. It was a great youth centre, really sort of great. And I said, listen, I've been told by the police and stuff, there's real problems here on Friday nights. How come you don't open on Fridays? To which one piped up, well, the kids go drinking on Fridays. True story. And the point I'm making here is that we have to get to people on their terms and not ours. We have to restore a connection, I think, that's been lost between the system and the person. Yet we have professionalised, we've built systems and processes around something that is not a process or a system, but a person. Something that at its heart is a human interaction. It's the humanizing of people's problems that is the solution. And that is the value that should underpin public service. In every job I've been given and every job that I've done, I try to start by getting on a train to where the people are to see for myself how people live, how people love, talking to them and listening to them about their lives. To put the human experience back into a system that we have actively sometimes set out to dehumanize. Sometimes I think because if we realise the suffering that people actually were exposed to, it would simply be too much. Better to think of John as a number than a human being that we had forgotten and that we had decided in many ways not to help. During my time in the civil service on this project or that, I've often sat through, though my attention level is low, presentation after presentation. I've seen strategy documents, keep in touch, bird tables. I could give you jargon till the cows come home. I've gone from words like poverty to social exclusion to social justice, to social mobility, and I'm not sure what we are now, but they're all the same thing. They're people that have no money and have no power. And I've looked at these things and I've listened to these people. How can we make the system work better if we further digitalise or in many cases depersonalise our interaction? I would say categorically that success comes from doing the exact opposite of that. If we can, and we can't always achieve this, is putting the person, their humanity, their human frailties, and their real life experience right at the very centre of the services that we are trying to provide. We tried to do that with the Troubled Families Project, and that to this day remains one of the things I am very actually proud of. The programme wanted to and achieved reaching out to over 100,000 vulnerable families by trying to get under the skin of their problems and in many cases offering the very real and practical support they needed to improve their lives. Some of us believe that they wanted their lives to be better, to get their kids going to school, to get jobs and to have the same kind of lives that many of us in the room have tonight. Workers helping them believe in them and worked with them to make this so. Families in that programme had an average of 8 very significant problems relating to work, education, health, domestic violence, child protection and so on. Many social policy experts will tell you just one of those problems can actually derail a family, 8 can hold them back generations. Now don't fall under any illusion that I'm soft or anything. It is about challenging as well as supporting. I can remember very, very clearly sitting in the front room of one of our families in a house that was frankly uninhabitable, strewn with rubbish and chaotic, and listening as the mum described to me how she got just a little bit behind with her recycling. And I was very entertained that she called her family intervention worker her family interference worker. And they sat next to each other on the settee. I went back, and actually in that particular case, the reason that woman she was facing eviction, that's why it was a Nottingham Family Intervention Project, and she was facing eviction. She had 10 children. She had had a multiple level of abuse in her life. And one of the reasons why they couldn't keep on top of the recycling, the place was a mess, was that it boiled down to the kids constantly taking the doors off all the internal places and throwing them out the back. And this is what was cited on the piece of paper. Well, the kids removed the doors because, as some of us who work in this world understand and know, the kids knew better than anybody that if the dad or one of the dads could see the children watching him, they were less likely to beat their mother up. And that's why they took the doors off the hooks. And that's kind of really better than anything I can say tonight. It's about not judging everything immediately and seeing what lies behind. And that's difficult in cash-strapped times of targets and implementations and all of those things. But that's what we have to hang on to when we're in public service. At best, these families do have dedicated family intervention workers, and it has worked in many ways. And I know it's not perfect. It is about skips to clear away the rubbish, giving mum and others the confidence to end those abusive relationships, not always them having to leave the home and go to a refuge, perhaps getting him out so that he actually doesn't have to go back, and making sure the kid has a clean uniform and an alarm clock so they can get up and go out to school as a family without us helping them. I believe, and I think many others do, that there are 2 major silver bullets to end poverty and to deal with social policy, and that is a good education and a job. And in my view, nothing else matters more than that. And there's a reason for being in a university. So that is all good public service seen right there, and it's been a privilege for me to be part of those things that I've talked about. But I think none of us can deny that we haven't got this right in the past, and I include myself in that. None of us want to keep going back to the same estates, the same homes, the same families, and seeing the same misery year after year. I do and did go back to those same estates, seeing the same misery year in, year out. Only recently I was standing in a shopping parade in the northeast that I've been to for various times in various jobs over various years, meeting community workers, visiting the community centre, actually being saying the same graffiti shutters that the kids have been, nice, done type stuff. I'm clearly not right on at all, am I? You can tell. And I thought, dear God, don't let me be back here in 5 years and it's still the chain. Because children deserve more. And I think sometimes public services, we've gone about this the wrong way round. We wanted to tackle poverty on the poorest housing estates. So we asked tenants what they wanted, and in response we did the easy bit. We put money into buildings, into lighting and into landscaping. We wanted to improve outcomes for children, so we set up centres and we hoped that the needy would turn up at the door. We wanted to reduce domestic violence, but instead of tackling the brutal behaviour learnt at the knee often of their own father, we gave the partner bars on the windows and panic buttons. We missed something. Of course, all of that work is good and important, but it isn't good enough, and it wasn't good enough. We missed our biggest asset, humankind. That which we all have to give, the giving of ourselves, faith in the power of humanity to do good. And I profoundly believe, if we get this right, we can rehumanise public services, and when we do so, we will change families and communities for the better. I have also seen what happens when public services go wrong. Strong, purposeful leadership can be, of course, an enormous force for good, but the lack of leadership, the failure to tackle things because they're too hard, can have a catastrophic effect on people's lives. Nothing brought this home to me more than when I had the privilege, with a great team, to conduct an inspection into Rotherham Council following the wonderful Alexis Jay's report into child sexual exploitation in that town. I was expecting to find a local authority and a police force that was racked with guilt, wanting to learn the lessons of what had gone wrong, and instead I found denial. Denial of a problem due to fear that of being honest would have had too many tough implications. Denial of the reality of what was happening to children in their communities. Children's care files with the word Pakistani removed for fear of upsetting people, not helping anyone at all, not least the Pakistani community. They did them a disservice. Denial by the police and public services of what was happening right under their noses. Tolerating underage pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases in very young girls with considerably older men written down on their files as their boyfriends. Denial of the facts that these girls were victims, not wayward teenagers asking for it. Denial that child sexual exploitation was a crime and it's straightforward abuse. It was a terrible failure, and I've had long time to reflect on what I saw and heard in Rotherham, and it pains me still. What pains me most is how we, decent, good public servants, ending up allowing the wrong thing to happen. And I now believe it's almost like a dial that keeps moving and you end up in an incredibly wrong place. First of all, the 13-year-old child is seen as a 13-year-old teenager with a voice and a life that can't be challenged. Clock. Dial that actually, having checked the file, you realise that they don't come from a decent family, quote, they come from a broken home. So this is kind of what we expect. Clock. Dial that actually, though he's an older bloke, he's a decent boyfriend, and she calls him his boyfriend, and she doesn't like us and doesn't want to be with us. And what's with him? He's only 24, and he's still quite young. Clock. Dial, in my view, of acceptability and unacceptability, where we end up saying that someone's rape is consensual sex. And then one day, and I have interviewed this woman much later on, for her 13th birthday, in my view, she was raped by a man, and he could then say to her, no one will believe you because it's now you are consenting to this sex. And that's what the dial does. You don't know it's happening in some degrees, but one day, because you're not prepared to talk about it, you're not prepared to look at it, you're not prepared to see what's happening, and actually then the dial moves too far. And you can see actually that this haunts me to this day. How did we end up in a situation where good people did nothing? And is this happening in other ways in our country today? And I probably argue that it is. And the starting point is we have to talk about the difficult things. Moving on, that was a bit too much. Sorry, everyone. You've got a glass of wine. It's a nice evening. You'd probably rather be outside in the sun, and I'm getting myself emotional in my own few words. Forgive me for that. My most recent work, I just checked time because I'm obviously also, I'm all right, actually. Okay, that's unusual for me. My most recent work has been into integration and opportunity in our most isolated communities. This has clearly been a really tough project to look at, in part because it's so topical that actually everybody has a view on it, and often those views are conflicting and different in so many different ways, and the stakes clearly are very, very high. We are a great and tolerant country that wants everyone just to rub along. That's an expression that's used over and over and over. Queuing, rubbing along, all of that type of stuff. So much so that sometimes I think we find it impossible to countenance and counter the fact that this simply isn't true for everyone. Our tolerance of difference has, to my mind, allowed some, and those that are intolerant of difference, to get away with promoting destructive and negative values. Whether this is the far right or Islamist extremists, we all need to work harder to counter this and to call it out more for what it is, and to have the very difficult discussions that many want to avoid. None of this is easy. The reaction to my report was fascinating in that all I said is, can you at least talk about what I'm saying in the report? Even if you disagree or agree with elements of it, can we have a national conversation and a national debate? 3 atrocities later, Andrew Neil said on the BBC, it is time for a national conversation. None of it's easy. Too many leaders have chosen, in my view, to take the easier path when confronted with these issues in the past, sometimes with good intent, but that has often resulted in problems being ducked, swept under the carpet, or indeed allowed to fester. In all of the roles that I've held, either in the third sector, in homelessness organisations such as Shelter or other charities I've worked in, or indeed in the last 18 years working in governments and for ministers, I have tried to shine a light into the dark spaces and to illuminate some of the shadows in as kind a way as I think is possible to do for me. This lecture was called Faith in Public Service, and it's about my faith in public services. To quote George Michael, you got to have faith. But that faith can be in human values as well as, or instead of, religious. There is a real dignity and honour in doing service for and with others. I believe in a hand up, not a hand out. That's John Bird's quote, not mine. Helping people stand on their own 2 feet, get on with their own lives, not creating dependency on charities, nor indeed on a system. I believe in people power. If you're here today, with a job, without a job, a public servant or not a public servant, we're all citizens of this world, and many of you of this great city, and we all have the power and capacity individually and together to treat people with dignity and compassion, and in doing so, help them live a better life. That can be opening a door, it can be letting somebody sit down on a bus, or it can be running a charity or a university. I believe in the power of love and of kindness. I believe in the hope that humanity brings, and clearly I believe in the service of others, in our capacity to love and indeed to forgive. I was always humbled by the parents of whose children had been murdered or killed by manslaughter. And when you meet them and you realise they have the capacity to forgive, then those of us that have not experienced those sorts of horrific things that are unspeakable because they're so unnatural, we need to reach into ourselves and have the power to forgive. To be good to each other, to connect with each other because we share the same basic humanity, and actually we all share the same basic needs. I may stand here in a suit today, but I'm not going back to a soup kitchen or a cardboard box tonight. We all share the same basic needs. I learnt those values through faith. I'm not ashamed of that. I'm proud of that. But not because of faith, and they have guided me through my work and my life. They are the principles through which I try my best to live my life. For me, faith is simple. It is love, it is kindness, it is hope, all knitted and enacted together. Does this sound familiar to some? And now these three remain, faith, hope and love, but the greatest of these is love. The doughtiest fighters I have met who taught me those values, yes, they were nuns. It was they who set me on this journey, which is probably the reason I'm here today, and of course I thank them for that. But actually, I believe it is human values that underpin the best of public service. Public service values are at the end of the day about faith in people, about hope that no one should be left vulnerable and everybody has a part to play, and love, which is our gift to each other and to mankind. Thank you very much for coming this evening and listening so very kindly to me. I'm grateful to you and I wish you well.
Some hugely powerful and current food for thought. We've got quarter of an hour or so for questions. I'd like to give as many people as possible a chance to ask questions, so if you could keep your questions brief and to the point, that'd be very helpful. Yes, sir.
Hello. Oh, I don't need that. I'll put my teacher voice on.
Oh, God.
We spoke quite a lot at great length about humanising people's problems. And as a good Catholic lad, I, a few years ago, was suddenly in a major situation with my mother who had dementia, so I gave up my job, I bought the house next door for her and tried to look after her. And I thought that all of the people in my local authority were good, decent folks like me who were going to help me to look after her. Nothing could have been further from the truth. She slowly got basically ripped off by other neighbours who befriended her and stole her money. The police would now help. How could I provide evidence when she couldn't provide it herself? Yeah, and I had the only evidence and I offered that, and it was just one catastrophe after another, and the only thing that they could offer was to put her into a home. Now I said, what could possibly be better than her young son living next door to her to care for her needs? So I fought it tremendously. But what they did, they rang my older brother up in Liverpool, the other side of the country, and he said, yeah, he's having a hard time. You put her in a home, that'll be okay. And his voice was more important than mine. Now, I'd just like to ask you, because all my bitter experiences has taught me that a lot of these public service jobs are merely careers that people are just following, and they're hiding behind funding, or they're hiding behind the fact that they haven't got the laws in place to be really effective. I just wonder what you think.
Well, I mean, my own mother spent the most appalling end of her life, not in exactly that same situation. But I couldn't get over that people that were nurses and doctors and care workers could be, frankly, the end product of what they thought was caring was brutal. And I think that the issue that I'm trying to say here today, and one of the reasons I want to take this forward when I leave the civil service, is that we are dehumanising at every single stage. It's a series of transactions. So our social care system, in my view, for the elderly, is just, it misses the person. It forgets the person. And I don't think those people that are in those jobs, I mean, I'm sure there will be people that see it solely as a career in terms of, you know, getting money in the bank, getting a larger job title and becoming a director or whatever. But my experience of numerous public servants is that wasn't their starting point. It wasn't their starting point, and for many of them, they are as frustrated by the system you've just described as you are. I don't know why your brother was... I don't know your individual case, but it's not the first time that I've heard those sorts of things being put to me, which is why I'm now relentlessly on this journey to say, can we just stop for a minute? You know, the reason people go out on the street and hand out soup is because they're so frustrated that nobody is doing anything to help the human being on the street. You know, the public themselves are tired of seeing people essentially not getting the right sort of help. And I think the social care industry, and I call it an industry, is an epitome where in certain cases we've lost our way. We've lost our way. It's just too complicated. It feels dehumanised. You know, case after case in the newspapers of care workers abusing. How does that happen? And it happens because the dial shifts. You know, something's too difficult one day, so they decide not to clean the person. Then another day, that person's too difficult, so they put them in what they call the music room. This is a case that's just the people were just. I'm only telling you what I've read in the media. You know, so they put them in the music room. Then the music room or the art room turned into essentially a punishment room, and they took everything out of it. And these were elderly people. Now, I imagine at the very beginning of all of that, the people that started and now are in prison didn't necessarily start out to do that to those people. Some will. I'm not stupid. There are some very nasty folk out there that get a pleasure out of abusing people. I've met too many paedophiles and others not to know that humanity has a side which, you know, leaves a lot to be desired. But I think that's my problem with all of this. That's why public services need to be talked about in a different way. We need to remember that, you know, it's okay to do work for free. It's all right to be a volunteer. It's all right to have a voice if you're the person that's homeless on the street. I can't help you with what you're talking about, but I entirely recognise the problem that you've described. And I think the solution lies in more people talking about what the values and the beliefs and the underpinning of why people should be in public service, and to remind ourselves of it constantly. How many people do values on these courses before they end up in these jobs? Very few. How many people use the word love? We're so frightened to use the word love because we think we're crossing boundaries. So too many people in places, a man can't do that to a woman. In case what? You know, we've lost our way. I'm not daft about paedophiles and nasty people. Of course I'm not. I'm as tough as old bloody boots. But there's a place for love. And there's a place for talking about love, and we've forgotten it. We've just bloody forgotten it. You know, I forgot it at points as well. We forget it. And that's what's missing in that case. A system that doesn't know about love, basically.
Thank you for that.
Didn't mean to
question.
snip at the end, just
Yes.
feel quite emotional about it.
It's a short one from me. How do you feel about the rhetoric around the Troubled Families Initiative evaluation?
What can I say? What can I say? I feel... What can I say? I know that that programme helped a lot of people that would not have otherwise got help. I know that that there are a lot of people that want to knock the programme. There are people that say it took money away from other programmes. Austerity was happening anyway. Those services in local authorities were going to be cut anyway. And actually going and get £500 million to inject back into local authorities, into children's services and into family intervention, that's fine by me, really. I've met too many families that have been helped by that. No, I couldn't mandate from the centre that every single family should have a family intervention worker. That's what you get when you work in central government. My disappointment was that when the evaluation reports came out, I wasn't able to go out and describe what I thought about the programme. I know where the problems were in that programme, and they are not how the publicity went in December. So you're talking to one very, very frustrated individual. But I'll be out on the 31st of July and able to say whatever I want to say, however way I want to say it, whenever I want to say it. And I felt some of the publicity let a legion of families down and a legion of workers down. You know, we had... Yeah, nothing's bloody perfect, is it? You know, what was I going to do? Wait round for another 300 years for, forgive me, a university to do a 3-year study whilst my money had come and gone, my opportunity had come and gone to help 120,000 families? Was I ever? It's like, you know, no, at the beginning of the Rough Sleepers programme, I started where they started. You know, there were people that didn't want homeless people to never go into the dormitory. And I said, have you met some ex-servicemen? They're never going to come in unless you put them in a dormitory to begin with. It's like, I am a pragmatist. So no, the programme wasn't perfect, but it's damn sight better than those people tried to make it sound last year. That's all I'll say. More of that on the 1st of August.
Watch the space. Yes, sir.
I've got two very short questions. Thinking of public service in its broadest aspects, did you ever offer advice to ministers about the London-centric culture, and are you optimistic that genuine devolution might be following? And the second question is, as you leave the civil service, what advice would you offer to those hard-working, decent, conscientious civil servants who've been attacked for 7 years, denigrated, and who've lost self-esteem and self-confidence because ministers haven't a good word to say about them?
Well, obviously, I'm currently still a civil servant, and I am to the 31st of July, so I'll be more guarded than I will be later in the year about some of what you've raised. On the serious, I'm not being flippant about that as well. I do feel quite strongly and passionately about the denigration of public life and public service, because it suits nobody. If anybody thinks they're helping by essentially denigrating public life and public servants, they're not getting us anywhere, because there are legions of people out there that need to have hope, who do not have empowered voices and privilege. And it's somebody said to me, a homeless person actually in America stood up at a conference, and she said to me afterwards, it's one thing, the privileged fall on mattresses, we fall on cement. And I thought, God, that was brilliant, right? And the problem I have with the denigration of public service is that it makes people believe that everybody that's even a volunteer in a night shelter is somehow out for themselves. And I don't think that gets us anywhere. I'll say more about that later in the year. In terms of devolution, I think I've said this before, actually, at the Local Government Association conference, so I'll say it again. It's in everybody's interests for devolution in government to happen. You know, as of the summer last year, devolution was there because actually, let's face it, the more that it is pushed out of central government and left to people locally, you can either swim or you can sink or swim. So there's a hard edge to some of this, which is the upside is local people get more power and more ability to make the choices over the monies in the way that they want. And if they're effective and know how to do that, then devolution will work for them. If they're not effective and don't know how to do it properly, then they'll sink. And so I think, and the other thing at the end of the day, as the public showed last Friday, they have their own voice and their own power. And those of us in Westminster should remember that, really. So I better be careful.
Thank you. Other question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, on a technical point, it was last Thursday, but that doesn't really matter.
Sorry, yeah.
It's all right.
I was up all night. It feels like the longest, the longest time.
If
really.
I don't sound all that coherent, it's because I had your wine, your portion of the wine earlier, which was very good, by the way. I looked into your review that you prepared last year into social integration and opportunity, and two things came across very strongly. Uppermost was the promotion of the English language. And it was very interesting to note that when you look at what happened with the application for EU nurses, it's decreased enormously because of the English language requirement.
Yeah.
Is asking people to learn English before they come here a potential solution? And the other thing is, listening to somebody today on BBC4, because I don't know whether it's fortunate or not fortunate, I had the opportunity to listen to Hiba Wadri talk about her book, which is very upsetting, quite honestly. Well, how can you handle female genital mutilation if these 65,000 apparently vulnerable women are sent back to their own homes, their own countries, to be cut because of the fear of ostracism and the desire to fit in by their culture? And where do you stop and start? So what about male genital mutilation, for example? Nobody worries about that, but it's not a medical necessity. I'm not being flippant. I'm just trying to make the point that it must be very difficult for you in your positions to decide. I hate that expression, British values. There's no such thing. And I really don't understand why people use that, because it's an ephemeral term and it has no application. But for you, how are you going to promote English language? Or how do you see it as a solution? And how do you get around people sending back their own daughters to be treated in such a barbaric and disgusting way?
Thank you.
Hang on, just getting this down.
Sorry
Democracy.
about that.
No, not at all.
Short. It's the wine.
I'm just jealous, don't worry. So I think it's something like 98% of the British public is a very, very high figure. This is a poll, but nevertheless, I didn't use it because it was a poll, but 98% of the British public think everybody that lives here should speak English. And sometimes the public are right. One of the reasons everybody should speak English is so that everybody can have the same equality and that they will be able to articulate for themselves without being dependent on other people their way through the system. And so the public are right on that one. I think that I take your point about the nurses. I personally think that one of the tensions, certainly for my mother, was that people couldn't speak English to her when she was lying in a hospital bed, and that created more tension, as it were. So she was being asked, who's the Prime Minister, such and such, and the woman kept as if she was, she had cancer and was dying. Her mind was fine, and they knew that on paper, yet they still went through these questions. And if I'm honest, it was made worse by the fact the poor girl that had to ask the questions didn't have a full command of the English language. And my mother is just ridiculously lovely. She was a lovely woman and had no, we come from a very mixed cultural place in many, many different ways. And yet that was quite challenging. So when we don't have English language, the point I'm making is that it can fuel something that I'm very uncomfortable with, which is racism. So there's lots of practical reasons for doing it, which is I need women that are suffering domestic violence not to have to go through their 13-year-old son to do the translating as to why dad is beating the shit out of her. So he tells dad, so she has the shit beaten out of her again. So that's one bit. And the other bit is there's a leveller to it, which means we're all in the same boat. Some might have better English, some might have worse English, but we're all in the same boat. It's a bit like education. If I could get everybody to the same level of education, if I could get, the reason that we hung on to 5 A to C's in New Deal for Communities areas, because we wanted those kids to at least get on a rung that could get them out of poverty. These things are levellers. Language and education are levellers. And then my third thing is, if you don't get the basics right, you have the antecedents for tension. So you have the beginnings of actually giving people the reason for that discord and that discomfort. So for me, the English thing was a no-brainer to put that in the report. I think it's a no-brainer as they go forward with their integration strategy. I think it needs to be targeted in areas. So yes, everybody's worried about the English as second language classes being cut in colleges and tech colleges. At the same time, I would argue that a lot of the people I'm worried about would never have got to those tech colleges in the first place. So at one level I can say big things. In other ways, I think you need sort of micro solutions to certain problems in order to, so, a woman that lives here who's 25 years of age and has no English is totally dependent on her man. Not keen on that. Kind of believe in women's rights. Last time I checked, we were equal to men. It gets trickier nowadays to actually recognise that picture, but it's still necessarily true. So that's one thing. The issue about female genital mutilation is that it is absolutely clearly been recognised by the police, the criminal justice system and the government and Parliament, who represent us, as a criminal offence. And the way that it is done is not just a criminal offence, it's inhuman. And this again comes to this kind of sense really, for me that's an extreme example where we have tried to be accommodating about difference in the name of culture or religion or other things, and we've lost our way. When we thought that doing that to a child was acceptable because somehow it's a cultural choice, we've lost our minds. And that's partly how we've ended up here. That's a more brutal way of the preface to my report. And partly then it comes to, I know lots of people aren't keen on the expression British values, but here's what I put it, kind of the rule of law, the same laws that protect religious minorities. I think we should talk much, much more about democracy, about the rule of the law in this country, that the laws that protect religious minorities are the same laws that protect people who are gay and want to get married, which is the same laws that mean I am equal to you and not disadvantaged by my gender. And this country, we don't think you can pick and choose from those laws. They are the laws of the country and they have gone through Parliament. And I think we should talk much, much more about that in our schools and worry a little less about sort of, doing the American, flag waving. Do you see what I mean? But I think at some level, I don't blame the government, though, for thinking that's a reasonable starting point. I mean, it's cool to be Scottish, isn't it? It's cool to be Welsh, it's cool to be Irish, it's cool to be Scouse, it's great to be a Londoner. But somehow we've lost our way. We think saying I'm English or British is suddenly a vote for the BNP. And it's not. It's simply not. I mean, our English football supporters sometimes leave an awful lot to be desired, it has to be said, and I don't like them being pin-ups for England. But England's an okay place too. We're not all BNP supporters. The George flag isn't a symbol of somebody that's horrifically right-wing. They might just be some football supporters. And somehow we have to talk about all of this. You could all think I'm totally wrong, but talk about it. Go home and talk about it. And then, if nothing else, we'll start to foster this debate. I find it fascinating that people are waving Welsh flags about, waving this about. The minute somebody waves a Union Jack about, they're suddenly a racist. And I think that's what we have to talk about. I'm proud to be British. I'm proud to be a cultural Catholic, and I'm proud to be Irish. I can be all of those things. The same way a woman living in the middle of Bradford can be proud to be Pakistani, proud to be from Bradford, and proud to be British. That's the beauty of this country. We can have multiple identities, but part of those identities mean where we come together around the institutions of Britain. And those institutions are our democracy, they are our law, and they are our freedom of way of life, where tolerance, of course, is tolerated, but you don't tolerate it when you cross over a line, and where women are locked up at home and can never leave in the name of something or other, where children may be abused in institutions in the name of something else, or whether you mutilate young girls. Getting to them is a bloody nightmare because they take them away and we can't keep... But, why are we allowing people... I couldn't get over it on troubled families, all this knocking of troubled families. Last time I checked, we said kids had to be in school for 90% of every single term. No excuses. Well, if we did that, wouldn't we be so disappearing off to Pakistan or to other areas for months whilst this is done to them? If we were very clear, troubled family, we'd be all over you if you took your kids out for more than 90% of a school term. So why am I tolerating that? So these things, I'm going on for ages, but I'm trying to show the complexity and the difficulty. Clearly, I've been on a journey for the last 2 years, and I've been on a journey for 28 years before that. And I may go forward and have other views as well, but this is where I am at this point in time.
Powerful emotion. A great point on which to end. Two words that we've heard a lot about tonight, love and hope. And I guess those are two of the reasons why 50 years ago students would have come to this university for the first time. And they're two words that are still as relevant today as they were 50 years ago. So what a great way to end Trinity Talks. Thank you very much indeed.